Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just wait a minute or two before we start to make sure people have an opportunity to log in and get settled. All right, we will commence. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bianca Bridgenath, and I am the Divisional Director of Social Gerontology and our education program here at the National Aging Research Institute. Welcome to our first seminar in aging for 2023. A little housekeeping first regarding Zoom. At the conclusion of the talk, we will have some time for Q&A. And if you have any questions, you can submit them throughout the seminar using the chat function, which can be opened using the chat tab at the bottom of your screen. And today's seminar will also be recorded and uploaded to our website within a few days. So if you do turn on your video to ask a question, keep in mind that your image will be included in the recording. I would like to begin today's seminar by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which each of us are meeting. For me, that is the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters across Australia, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, including members of the Stolen Generation. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I just would like to tell the audience a little bit about NARI, that is the National Aging Research Institute. We are a national leader in aging and aged care research, highly respected across the aged care industry and research sector nationally and internationally. For over 45 years, we have been dedicated to improving the lives of older Australians. Our vision is a world where older people are respected, healthy, and included. As a leader in translational aging and aged care research, education and training are core parts of our work. Through our education and professional development program, NARI promotes accurate information about aging in older people and enables best practice in the health and aged care workforce. Events such as today's seminar are ways by which we bring the most recent evidence and policy in aging and aged care research to the sector. With those kind of visions and tenets in mind, it gives me great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, who is Janet Anderson, PSM from the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. She is, in fact, the commissioner. Janet was appointed as the inaugural commissioner in January 2019, bringing to this role the knowledge, skills, and experience she has accumulated over many years working in the areas of aged care and health policy, strategy, and planning. Immediately prior to becoming commissioner, Janet was the deputy CEO and then acting CEO of the Department of Health in the Northern Territory. Over the last 20 or so years, she has also held executive positions in the New South Wales Department of Health, the Commonwealth Department of Veterans Affairs, and the Commonwealth Department of Health. In 2009, Janet was awarded a Public Service Medal for her significant contributions to health policy development and reform. Contributions she is seeking to build on through the Commission's work with the aged care sector in pursuing improvements in every older person's experience of aged care. Today, the Commissioner will be presenting Enabling and Promoting a Better Experience of Aged Care, Regulatory Challenges and Opportunities. Following her talk, we will also hear from Associate Professor Michael Murray, Chairperson of NARI, who has kindly agreed to be our discussant today. But for now, I'd like to very much welcome the Commissioner. Over to you.
Oh, thank you, Bianca, and hello, everyone. I really do appreciate this opportunity of spending an hour with you to share with you some thoughts on this topic, which I've chosen to discuss. I did provide an outline of the talk, and there's a trick question in the outline. If you read that middle sentence, how can an aged care provider get it right for everyone all the time? And the reason it's a trick question is because that actually isn't a reasonable expectation. And that's what I want to explore with you, whether you're a provider, a researcher in aged care, possibly a consumer or related to somebody who is currently receiving aged care? I think it's a really live question, and certainly from a regulator's perspective, we feel sometimes as if we're in the middle of a bit of a storm of different perspectives on that specific question. I want to start at the beginning, and I won't be tedious, I promise. We won't stay with the text for too long, but I do think it's instructive to reflect briefly on the universal purpose of regulation. Across the world, regulation exists to protect the public interest. And then in more recent times, contemporary public administration theory extends that and raises the bar for regulators by adding enhance, protect and enhance the public interest. And believe you me, that is a value-added proposition, and one that preoccupies me as leader of the aged care regulator in Australia. But when is regulated needed? We know what it is, but when is it used and why is it used? So governments regulate where a decision or activity or product or service has the potential to have an adverse impact on members of the public, and the unfettered operation of the market, the supply and demand interplay, does not effectively control or mitigate that risk. So risk exists, and there isn't adequate mitigation if providers and consumers go about their business without any guidance or control. So in other words, and it's an important takeout, regulation is designed to drive certain desired behaviours from the regulated entities. It's aimed at eliciting a certain response which is protective of the interests of the public. So what does a contemporary regulatory scheme look like? Most regulatory schemes the world over have these 5 characteristics: set of rules or offences that set the expectations of government with respect to particular businesses and so on, a set of market entry requirements that must be satisfied before the regulated entity can offer their service, a set of post-market obligations, the requirements that must continue to be met once they are within the market, then provision for monitoring enforcement by the regulator typically, and then the ability to regulate with consistency, integrity and independence. Now, those 5, probably you're doing a bit of head nodding, saying, yep, that all makes sense. I'm going to complicate the picture slightly by moving beyond those 5, which we can take as the core characteristics, and adding another 7, stay with me, which are often characteristics of regulators, not as universally, but certainly found in a number of regulators. So we go on from the 5. 6, risk proportionate approaches along a regulatory continuum. Flexibility to respond to changing circumstances. Mechanisms that incentivize excellence and lift performance rather than simply focus on requiring compliance. Using data-driven insights to identify risk, understand market performance and so on. Triaging processes that enable prioritization of the regulator's attention. An agile and responsive operating cadence informed by risk intelligence and collaboration with stakeholders across the regulatory environment. Now, the commission I lead works within a legislative platform, as it were, or set of parameters, and some of it is enabling and some of it is constraining. And the current Aged Care Act doesn't do a great job of enabling all of 6 through to 12. And that's one of the reasons that as work is now undertaken on the new Aged Care Act, and there are people busily drafting that right now, they're also considering what a new regulatory model or framework would look like within that act to allow the commission I lead, the regulator, to be more along the lines of these 12 characteristics, rather than being somewhat circumscribed in relation to elements of them by virtue of the Act being having its origins in the 1990s and being amended piecemeal, somewhat piecemeal over time. So I find myself interested in reflecting on this list of 12 and thinking how we would find them present in a new Aged Care Act to enable me to be the best regulator that I need to be and that the sector deserves, and that individual consumers have a right to expect. But in aged care, of course, it's never entirely straightforward. And what we find in the aged care sector is dual characteristics. And again, this has the risk of appearing abstract. It is material. I won't dwell on it, but I do want to make the point that aged care in Australia is both a social or public good on the left hand and a commodity. So on the left hand, we regard ourselves as citizens, as members of a society who have inherent rights. On the right hand, when we consider aged care as a commodity, we become consumers who enjoy a market of goods among which we make choices. Now, those of you who have any working understanding of aged care will see elements of both of these present in most aged care services: citizens or consumers, society or market, rights or choices. And we're a bit hybrid. And depending on the people we're talking to and the argument that we're trying to pursue, we might reach for one or the other, but reaching for both is complicated and is the reality within which the Commission operates, the regulator operates. So what I've tried to do in the subsequent slides is unpack some of those relationships, and I've called it the regulatory triad. No evil underpinnings there intended: consumer, provider, and regulator. So let's start with the consumer, where we must always start. Older people and those who love them deserve to have trust and confidence in the safety, quality, and experience of aged care. So what we find is, with respect to their care, older people assume it is safe, expect it is good quality, and hope it supports and preferably enhances their quality of life. Now, an equivalence is often drawn, as this is expanded upon, with air travel. So the aircraft you fly on, you assume it's going to be safe, right? You take for granted that it has 2 wings and the right number of engines and it's all working well. You have paid a certain amount for the ticket, and it gives you a certain level of expectation about the quality, the comfort of the seats, the quality of the meal, the in-flight entertainment. And then you hope that all that comes together into a wonderful travel experience. So that's the difference between assume, expect, and hope. But there is a key difference as I was thinking this through, because in aged care, after the Royal Commission particularly, and with some enduring impact, we find aged care consumers and their families in numbers fearing that none of the above might be the case. None. Now, when you travel by air, you don't fear that it's going to be unsafe unless you have a fear of flying. You get on the plane trusting that the wheels will stay on and the wings will operate as wings must, and that the engines are fine. You don't fear that is unsafe. But aged care, we have some consumers and some family members and some members of the public who fear that none of those three is the case. And that's a problem. We have a trust deficit, and we've got some serious work to do as a sector and as a larger community in remedying that. So what do consumers expect of the regulator? They expect that we will protect every consumer and ensure that they're safe and free from harm, that we will ensure that their care is high quality, and that they are treated as individuals with respect, dignity, and kindness. Now, because the regulator does not provide care, and in fact, that would be a deep conflict of interest if we were to do that, because we don't, we have to achieve those three things by holding providers to account for the way they interact with consumers, the standard of care they provide, and the experience of care they enable. Now, consumers specifically and the media generally also do something which isn't on those slides, and that is they often, not always, but they often expect that there will be consequences when providers get something wrong. And I spent a little bit of time going back over some old media. It was a bit triggering, I have to say, but you can have a quick glance through these headlines, and if you bother to read some of the text below, clearly this is a media intent on a particular agenda, and that is firstly to describe the regulator in various terms: watchdog, aged care czar, which was one that I didn't relish, tough cop, but also perhaps falling short of that expectation. And indeed, there are some more headlines which tell a similar story. So the media, the members of the public have certain expectations of the regulator in terms of this holding to account role. And for many people, the holding to account role is, and there will be consequences if they get something wrong. And for some people, consequences equals punishment. Now, I need to say very quickly, punishment is not part of my commissioned lexicon. It is not a tool in the regulator's toolkit which is at all effective. When we go to the higher intensity interventions, what we're doing first and foremost is acting to protect the well-being of consumers and ensuring that we have totally captured the attention of the provider in order that they can turn themselves around and ensure that they are compliant with their obligations. Now, providers too have expectations of the regulator. They want to have confidence and trust that we are competent and capable, objective, unbiased, informed by evidence, fair, reasonable, consistent, constructive and engaging with them, and accountable. All of those are fair. And if there are any providers watching, and indeed there will be many around who would argue or would have a view that we aren't always all those things. Now, we can have a contest and debate about that. We certainly aspire to be all those things, and we continue to work at being all those things. And we may stumble from time to time. We are not perfect. But we do understand this is a legitimate set of expectations that providers have of us. Now, providers also have other expectations. They trust that we will minimize what they call regulatory burden. That is, we will avoid imposing administrative overheads or what they may conceive of as unnecessary work and avoidable costs that they do not perceive to deliver benefit to them. Now, we work at that, and we certainly understand that it is very undesirable to impose unnecessary demands on a provider, and we hope that we have a right touch approach, but we continue to work on that. The third and final expectation in my list of three is that the provider expects the regulator can, not will, but can exercise discretion in making findings of non-compliance and taking regulatory action based on consideration of the challenges in the provider's operating context. In other words, they are hopeful that we can and will treat compliance obligations as elastic depending on what's happening in the provider's world. Now, I went to the trouble of just listing a few of these things because I did want to assure those of you participating today that the provider, the regulator, the commission I lead, is very, very closely attuned to the operating environment. We look at this often, we analyse it, we have meetings about it, we do research and documentation of it because we must understand the context. But understanding the context is different from giving a free pass. So we have issues relating to the demand side of the picture, consumers and their family members, their complexity of care, their expectations. We have issues relating to resources, funding, staffing, infrastructure, aspects of the economy, including the unemployment rate, which flows directly into workforce supply and so on. And then the expectations and ambitions and commitments of the Commonwealth Government in relation to a very extensive and far-reaching reform program. So what can we legitimately expect of providers? They have all those expectations of us. And I haven't fully engaged with that last expectation, which is the elasticity of our expectation or our demands of them in relation to compliance. And how do we take into account context? Well, I'm coming to that. What we do as a commission is look for evidence to determine what level of trust and confidence we can have in the provider, that they reliably identify and understand risk, and that they're engaging with it positively, constructively, effectively. That's the positive risk culture. Now, a number of you would be familiar with our regulatory pyramid. If you've heard me speak before, you've probably heard me talk about this. It is key to what we do, how we do it, when we do it, and how much of it we do. Our happy place is the green zone. We go up the right-hand side of the pyramid, the left-hand side of the pyramid, as providers go up the right. So their compliance posture is key to our regulatory intervention. You get closer to the red with increasing levels of non-compliance and reducing levels of effort by the provider to address the deficit. And that's really important. So these are the sorts of things we look at closely, and I'm not going to go through the entire list because I'm conscious of time. We have a consideration of our trust in the provider. How well do they understand their responsibilities and obligations? Are they willing to address areas of non-compliance? How well positioned are they to take action? And indeed, what is their track record of success, either in maintaining compliance or returning to compliance where they have drifted away from it? And then we must also have in clear, close regard risk of harm to consumers. And this goes back to, is there discretion about non-compliance? Is the provider managing the care needs appropriately? Are there themes in feedback pointing to shortcomings? So what's the consumer saying about the service? Is the care environment safe? Are there risks of harm arising from poor financial management? And are there consumer characteristics that in and of themselves increase the potential or actual risk of harm? These are the things that we take into account. We don't exercise latitude in relation to operating environment where we perceive significant, genuine risk of harm, because we cannot. We exist to protect the public interest. We can't turn away from that. That would be a denial of a fundamental responsibility. Now, recently we've explored new geometric frontiers. Very exciting. We're thinking about moving away from the pyramid towards a diamond. It's actually a big step. And what it does is reflect for the first time the star ratings. What you can see is we've inverted our pyramid, and now you go down to the most serious regulatory intervention, which is the revocation, and you go up to excellence. So a happy place is still the green insofar as that's where we engage with providers, we educate, we inform, we advise, we guide. And now we're even happier as we move further north, but we will move south. We will go down into the diamond, depending on how we find the provider and their posture. Now, what this does, we haven't adopted it fully yet formally, but we are very attracted to it, and we think it actually serves a useful purpose in 2023, now that we have the star ratings taking us towards that 5-star goal. But what it actually does do is speak to a document we've had in our kit bag since we started in 2019, where we've identified that we have a very solid core of work to be done in the prevent space. The standards, the advice on the standards, the education about the standards, guidance on compliance with the standards. Everything you see in that column is actually about enabling and ensuring that providers know what to do and are doing it well because they are managing their risks and they have a very clear eye to the consumer experience and how that can be optimized. Now, there's also another way of framing this, and forgive me for a sequence of charts, but there are different ways of coming at the same question. This is another chart we have used since the outset. And what I find is this is more accessible to a number of providers than our regulatory pyramid. Two axes, continuous improvement on the y-axis and compliance on the x-axis. What we are hoping and expecting providers to be aiming for is top right, that they are not just fully compliant, but they are continuing to work on improving what they do every day. What we absolutely hope that no one is determined on staying in or getting anywhere close to, of course, is bottom left, failing, where they are both non-compliant and uninterested in addressing it. Untroubled that non-compliance exists, or unaware and unmotivated to find it and fix it. That is not a great place for a provider to be. If a provider is found to be in the failing category, we are moving towards the top of our regulatory pyramid or the bottom of our regulatory diamond fairly swiftly. And there will be consequences for providers who are willfully non-compliant. Now, this is a corrective to all that I've just said, because you may have fallen into the false sense of complacency that regulation is the be all and end all. And of course, regulation is a means to an end. It's necessary, but not sufficient. It will never, ever be sufficient. You can't regulate your way to excellence. Excellence starts with the consumer in the middle and the people most closely related to that consumer in those whirling circles out from them. Starts with the provider and the staff. Workplace culture, how well they know and respect the consumers as individuals, their understanding and management of risk, their ongoing efforts to maintain and improve every single consumer's experience and outcomes of the care that they're providing. Now, a much more technical way of saying the same thing, which isn't nearly as accessible, is this diagram, and I'm not going to loiter on it, but it is something that we present in some of our documentation to explain the role of the regulator vis-a-vis the expectations we legitimately have of approved providers and services who are much closer to the consumer on a daily basis and therefore have the opportunity of interactions and engagements which enable them to deliver the care that's required in the way that it's expected. And this is obviously a rhetorical device. Which is the better approach? Well, I don't think there's any prize for understanding which is the better of these two. Would I, as a regulator, prefer to hear a provider say, we'd better do that because otherwise we'll get into trouble from the regulator? Or the provider saying, let's find a way to do that because Kim has indicated that that's what they really want. So you're not adopting a defensive crouch, oh, we better do it because the reg will get into trouble otherwise. You are doing it because you are incentivized to deliver the care that a consumer needs and wants. Now, I'm going to move quickly to a bit of a case study, and I won't spend long here, but I think it is illustrative of some of the points I've been seeking to make. This data is, for many people, alarming. It is notifications of serious incidents across 3 quarters in 2022. And you can see the numbers building quarter on quarter if you look down to the total against the priorities 1 and 2. And you're looking at it and thinking, oh my gosh, 9,000, 10,000, 11,000, what on earth is going on? Fundamentally, this is an opportunity to learn, and I'm going to explain that. There are 3 things I want to say about that data. The first is the serious incident response scheme is having the impact that was intended. For the first time, we have more transparency and accountability by providers, more information about what they do when things go wrong. We have the providers paying close attention to mitigating risks to consumer safety and preventing incidents, and certainly preventing harm from incidents. We have a contribution that SIRS makes to our own risk profiling, and it informs our understanding to the way in which we interact with providers in assisting them to manage risks of harm to consumers. I will say there is no acceptable level of serious incidents, because journalists ask me this all the time. So do you regard that number as acceptable? I think it's a spurious question. There's no right answer to that. There is no acceptable level of serious incidents, but at the same time, there are inherent risks in delivering social care. And so a hallmark of a high-performing service is the effectiveness of their response when something does go wrong. And I'll come to that. Third point quickly, and I see that some of this is veered off the slide, but hopefully you can read it. Around 37,800 incidents across around 2,700 residential aged care services, RACS, means that there are approximately 14 notifications per service per year. That means that there are between 1 or 2 incidents per month in a residential service of average size. 1 or 2 incidents per month. So let's just understand what the data is telling us. The numbers look high. When you do the maths, that's the way it shakes out. And that's an epidemiological analysis. And the bit that's in the blue says, in aged care, there are less than 0.5 serious incidents per 1,000 care days. In acute care, in hospital environments, there are more than 10 incidents per 1,000 patient days. Now, you'd expect that. There are acute care environments. There are very, very sick people there. But we must do the proportional analysis. We must understand the figures in context and not just react to 9,000, 10,000, 11,000. Oh my God. We have to understand what we're looking at, and we have to use it to learn and improve. I'm going to tell you 3 quick stories. We looked at the analysis for unlawful sexual conduct or inappropriate sexual contact. And I won't go back to the slide, but that was telling us that there were 485 notifications, 452 and 633 in the 3 quarters. Wow, that's an interesting number. We did a deep dive, and we are hoping to publish this analysis in coming months. And I'm going to tell you 3 stories. First story is an individual in aged care required assistance to shower safely, and she was attended by 3 staff, one of whom seemed only to be watching rather than helping. And that wasn't explained to her. And to that consumer, it felt slightly voyeuristic. That was an incident notification. A person needed continence aids in residential aged care, and while the staff member was removing a used continence aid and replacing it with a new one, they brushed the woman's vulva, her external genitalia, with their hands. The woman was horrified and felt abused. That was a notification. A hoist was required to lift a man safely from his bed to a chair. Now, the sling was placed around the man, and he was naked at the time, and he was lifted using the hoist into the air. And then the staff who were managing this had to leave the room temporarily, and he was left suspended in midair, naked, in the hoist. His door was open, and everyone who walked past saw him naked in the hoist. He felt humiliated and embarrassed. That was a notification. So, sample of 3. It's not representative, but the point I'm trying to make, these are all examples of intimate care. They're all examples where there was insufficient attention given to sexual safety. So what do we learn from that? Do you see how rich this is? What that says to the regulator, and how we can communicate that to the sector and say, we've understood this in a particular way. We want to reflect it back to you, and we want you to reflect on your own performance. We want you to reflect on what you're saying to your staff, how you are teaching your staff to deliver care in a way which was respectful and dignified and kind. This is the continuous improvement loop of incident management that we publish. And as you can see, it's built on a very standard design, which is plan, do, check, act, right? I mean, you can go through the detail, but that's pretty much what it is. Respond to the incident in the moment, record it, analyze it, learn from it, implement actions, close the loop, and repeat for as many times as you need to continue learning in order to improve. And of course, this is the basis of continuous improvement, because repetition of that cycle consistently, if you do it well, gets you to a better place. So the fundamentals of the serious incident response scheme and incident management processes more generally is continuous improvement. We can learn, we can get better. Providers can reduce the likelihood of those notifications being made through the corrective action they take on learning that these are risks that are inadequately mitigated. And by the way, the reporting of the incident to the Commission is one part of one step. The value of serious incident notifications is in part what we, the regulator, get to learn and what we can reflect back to the sector, but it is so much about what the provider can learn about their own performance and how they can engage in that virtuous cycle of continuous improvement. There are a number of things that the Commission does in relation to serious incident responses. We monitor and assess services against the relevant standard. We manage complaints about incidents. We obviously administer the scheme. We provide guidance and education. We use the information that I've just demonstrated to understand risk. We certainly take proportionate action in relation to providers who are not adequately managing or responding to the risks or a particular incident. And we are getting better at and determined to do more of publishing information back to the sector, because we have access to the data. We can do the analysis and say, we see you in a particular way. How does this square with the way you see yourself? What can you learn and do better as a result of understanding this about yourselves? Now, these are the reforms that have recently been introduced and that are coming up. And this is a list that can send providers running from the room. I know it is intimidatingly long, but I raise it because does it represent regulatory burden or springboard for improvement? Now, clearly I come down on the latter. And if you're a provider online, you may well be ambivalent at best about that. But I see this as rich with opportunities for providers to shine. A lot of it will rest on these attributes: corporate governance, leadership, organizational culture, all of which surround the individual consumer. We have to put the consumer where they belong in the center of the picture. And for as long as they continue to exist, use the standards as the guide, supporting consumers to live their best, the best life they can in Standard 8. In Standard 1, I get to live the life I choose. You know, these are not vacuous, meaningless statements. These are there for a reason. They take us to the heart of the challenge of delivering quality aged care. This standard, Standard 7, talks to the staff directly, that they interact with consumers in a way which is kind and caring and respectful. A lot of the solutions turn on strong governance, effective leadership, and a thriving workplace, which in my view leads inevitably and automatically to the question that is in each staff member's mind, if they are well led, and that is, how can I as a staff member provide care in a way that supports and promotes the well-being and quality of life of this older person in front of me? This is my final slide. in aged care more than in almost any other domain of public policy at the moment in Australia, change is inevitable, but growth is optional. And what I want most of all is for providers to choose carefully, choose wisely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for that very, I think, impassioned and tour de force of regulation in a very engaging and captivating way. I would now like to invite Michael Murray, who's the chairperson of the NARI board, and I'd like to invite him to share a few thoughts with us on what we've heard today. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a rare privilege, and it's a great honour to even partially share the podium with my esteemed colleague. I, as perhaps some people know, have had the opportunity to work under Janet's tutorage, and though a poor student, did my best to collect the words and the essays of Janet Anderson for my subsequent book, How to Do Things Right. My team recently came to me and said, what are we going to do about falls? And I said, well, what aren't we doing about falls? Oh, well, you've got to realise, Michael, falls are inevitable. People fall over. And I said, yes, even I've done that. What are we doing about it? Because as Nari knows, we are one of the only 2 centres that I've ever been involved with. We're doing a comparison trial between us and one of our neighbouring health services in a single site. We're able to dramatically or significantly affect our falls rate. And I said, we've done the research. We showed benefit, which is almost unheard of. What have you done? Oh, well, we couldn't sustain it. And I said, oh my God. The hallmark, I'll go back to what Janet said, a hallmark of a high-performing service is the effectiveness of its response when something goes wrong. And even more important, don't wait for it to go wrong. Fix it before it goes wrong and continue to fix it. One of the exciting things that Janet's, the Plan, Do, Study, Act, the thing I most love, both as a clinician and as a relatively poor, admittedly, researcher, is that we've got to understand our incidence and our risk and enable continuous quality improvement. And it's the continual striving that is so absolutely part of all of our roles as a hallmark of governance and a hallmark of leadership. People say, I don't come to work to do a bad job. Well, that's absolutely true. I've met few where that's ever been the case in 35 years. But at the same token, coming and not thinking about the role, thinking about opportunities. Quality comes first in the commission before safety, because with quality, safety will follow. In hospitals, it's all about safety, then quality, because they don't really quite yet get it. That if you develop a quality and learning environment where you continually strive to do better, there is the opportunity, and there is the expectation raised by us as consumers. Now, in my role as a geriatrician, I get rung probably on a daily basis, and it usually starts like, you don't know me, but, or I'm from X hospital, or we once worked together. I've had 1,000 registrars, let's be honest. And I've got an issue or concern about my mother. What that tells me is that when push comes to shove, we understand quality in a very visceral way. And we create expectations in the same manner about people we love and care for. With that in mind, I find that the work that Janet and the Commission does is truly inspirational. Now, I sit on a number of boards, and do we get it always right? Absolutely not. Do I suffer on each and every occasion with concerns and worry about finances, staffing, training? How am I going to train people with a 24, 30, 40% turnover? It's an absolute nightmare. but I'm still in there swinging the bat. And we are still aiming for a 5-star rating because, quite frankly, who is ever going to want less? Not for ourselves, not for others, not for anybody. So I find this incredibly inspirational. I find the information provided by the Commission available to us is very accessible. And I am extremely grateful for people like Janet, who I've had the privilege to work with, and her executive team, who have made a real difference in an area where, quite frankly, all of us are responsible for, and all of us have been somewhat suboptimal over the preceding 20 or 30 years. And I think we've come a long way. And I know that my colleagues sometimes want to blame the Commission, and I hear this quite regularly. It's the Commission's fault. If only they gave us more latitude, if only they accepted more mediocrity, we'd all be fine. But quite frankly, who's going to have the mediocrity? Which one of our loved ones will be in the place of mediocrity? And it certainly is not going to be mine. And hopefully it's not going to be me. So I think that there is, as per usual, it's inspirational and opportune. And I'm grateful for Janet's work and the difference she's made. And it just shows that you can pivot from youth justice to aged care, incredibly flexible, turn your mind to virtually anything and still fix it. So, as a public vote of thanks for people like Janet and her team, which quite frankly have been right in the middle of the mash at times. If we didn't have people such as Janet and her executive team and her entire team that weren't striving to improve, it's not going to be better for us as well. So a vote of thanks and a vote of appreciation. Opening the floor.
Thank you, Michael. So we do have time for Q&A. And so if you do have any questions, please submit them now through the chat function. Alternatively, if you would like to ask your question in person, you can turn on your camera and microphone as well, and we will call on you in turn. So we have that opportunity now. Joan, I can see you've put your video on. Go for it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janet. That was really wonderful. And we've followed your work very, very closely. And my area is continence management, so it's absolutely thrilled that you brought up that wonderful example. And Tanari has probably Australia's only program of research on continence care in looking at the care needs of vulnerable older people. I guess one of the things that I've wondered about, or I've found in research, and others have found too, is that the way that people understand the standards is very variable. So, so obviously the current standards are a huge improvement on what we've had in the past, and they're so accessible and consumer-centric. But things like, the story that you told about how residents interpreted a continence care as a violation of their dignity and as sexual abuse. In the grounded theory research I did for my PhD, I found that staff actually felt that they were protecting residents' dignity because they were, they felt that they had to deliver care this way. So it brought home to me, and I've written about this incredible variation in how people understand what good care is, despite standards. I'm sure you've got a perspective on that.
Oh gosh, Joan, there's so much to explore in your comments. Yes, it's inevitable because the standards are words; they're not numbers. They are subject to interpretation. They can be read up, they can be read down, as in expanded or minimised. They can be put to one side as less relevant to a particular circumstance because there are other characteristics or factors involved, and so on. As a regulator, we seek to contain or shape some of that through our guidance products. Now, I'm the first to admit we've got better at that over time. I think our first outing was a fairly technical document, which was not only challenging to wade through, but possibly somewhat overly complex in terms of a translational piece of work. What does this mean to me in my practice, my day-to-day hands-on care? And I think what we ended up doing was giving something to providers that they had to rewrite in order that they could use it as a bit of a training manual. Well, that's unsatisfactory. That's just extra work for no end. So what we're now far more proficient at and still learning about is the way in which to provide guidance or develop educational material, whatever it might look like, fact sheets and so on, which give a really straightforward account of not just the requirement embedded in the standard, but what this might look like from a consumer's experience perspective, from a worker delivering care. Now that extends the range of products. It becomes a more voluminous task. You know, there's more to do because you need to think of different audiences, you need to think of different ways of presenting information and so on. And if I can just add another layer of complexity, because after all, this is aged care, we have also before us the revised standards, that there is work underway right now to renew, redraft a number of the standards. And indeed, you may have seen the consultation document released late last year, which has now found a point of landing, which will allow us to trial a methodology to assess against these draft strengthened standards. So it feels as if they're still relatively new, and you made a point of referring to the adoption in July 2019 of the new standards, and goodness knows they were very new then. Our experience is providers are becoming more familiar with them. It was tough during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, when we weren't able to visit as many services. We weren't able to reinforce on the ground in a practical way what compliance looked like, what best practice looked like, and so on. We're doing more visits now. We have greater opportunities for interacting and having those discussions. And we're also now deeply involved in the development of these strengthened standards, which will change the ground again. But I can say with great optimism and a high degree of confidence, what we've learned since July 2019 will stand us in excellent stead. And I think this go out, where we are again on the hook for ensuring that providers know what they have to do and are given strong, useful guidance on how to do it, I am quite confident that we now know more how to do that effectively, and we will be a better regulator for the assistance we provide to the sector generally, that will allow them to not just comply, but do so confidently and with a high degree of capability. Forgive me for a long-winded answer, but it was a really interesting way of setting the question that you gave me.
Thank you.
We've got a few comments and questions in the chat. The first one is from Tony Van Woot. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, Tony. He says, my family member recently passed away due to neglect. Dehydration and malnutrition diagnosed by an emergency department specialist. The Commission has not followed up on my complaint.
Okay, well, then quite clearly we have fallen down on the job. It's a single instance of a complaint that we clearly haven't performed against is one too many. And I say that without any guile whatsoever. If there genuinely has been no contact, then I apologise, and I would be happy to look into it if details could be provided to me offline.
We might look into that. The other question that comes through is from Amber Mills, and the question is, if compliance posture is key, how can providers be best supported in striving for their best? Is this the role of the Commission?
Sorry, start that again. Is if the compliance posture is
key? If compliance posture is key, dash,
yes.
How can providers be best supported in striving for their best? Is this the role of the Commission?
Oh gee, another fascinating question which would take us in any number of directions. I have an open question in my mind about the extent to which a regulator has a job to motivate a provider. As far as I'm concerned, and I might be fairly clear in my thinking on this, if a provider signs up to receive Commonwealth subsidy, to deliver aged care, then they sign up to a range of requirements and obligations under the Act. And I think there's open question as to whether additional motivation or incentives are required. I think it's the price of the ticket to play. If you put your hand up and say, choose me, I want to be an approved provider and I can satisfy your criteria for market entry, then you have effectively committed yourself to complying by the rules. So I'm not sure what additional incentive might be required. However, having said that, I actually do think the star ratings will operate increasingly as an incentive. Michael made the same point, that the existence of 5 stars and the application of 5 stars to a small proportion of the sector on the basis of their performance against 4 composite indicators gives everyone else who is not on the 5-star category something to shoot for. And I think reputationally and sometimes commercially, that is definitely in a provider's interest to be able to say, to claim, and bragging rights. Look at us, we have 5 stars. Well done you. You've clearly got a lot right in order to acquire that status, and you deserve to be able to talk about it out loud. So there are growing numbers of incentives in the systems, but I come back to my base point. If you're receiving Commonwealth subsidy, you have core obligations, and that goes with the territory.
Thank you very much. Michael, last question to you, a quick one, and then we will wrap up for today.
As part of my sabbatical, I had the opportunity to view the data of the predecessor of the serious incident response collected by Victorian government on its residential care facilities over several years. And it's quite a rich tapestry. And I said, this is marvelous. What are you doing with the information? And it's exactly the same as for hospitals. Michael, this is confidential.
No.
And I said, what an unusual concept, so why are you collecting it? Because how are we learning from knowledge? How are we learning and striving to do better? How are we acknowledging our imperfections, but saying tomorrow I will do better because I will learn, I will study, I will act. And I think this is what's new on the market. And I congratulate Janet for her sharing of the data, because in hospitals and previously in residential care, we weren't sharing the data. We had no idea, and we weren't, it's much more difficult to do better if you can't figure out how the exemplars are doing it well, and if you can't see what you can do and opportunities to improve. And I think this is fundamental to human nature, is to strive to do better. And it's why we all come to work, and it's why places like NARI exist. It's not to collect research to shove on in a book or in a library. It's actually to translate that into outcomes, because that's our fundamental principle, and it's what motivates us. And it's marvelous that that is increasingly getting traction over privacy or locking things away. So I compliment the Commission and saying that by sharing our opportunities and by being aware of where we can do better, this gives us and supports our striving to do better. So, thank you very much again, Janet.
Thank you.
All right, now we're absolutely on the hour. So unfortunately, I'm going to close the Q&A. Some compliments and praise also coming through the chat, saying thanks, Janet, for a very insightful and thought-provoking presentation, and also for highlighting the importance of context. Could you all please join me in thanking the Commissioner and Michael with your clap reactions, please? So thank you, everybody. And next month, we're going to have Dr. Terry Chong presenting on exercising your worries away, the potential of physical activity interventions to reduce anxiety. That will be on Tuesday, the 14th of March at 12 p.m. In the meantime, stay safe, everybody, and thank you very much for attending our program.